NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Thank you everyone who is here for this panel today. I feel so blessed and lucky to be in this space with you discussing such an important topic. And I'm joined by three brilliant humans, so I'm also thrilled about that. We have Dr. Cami Chavis, who is the professor of law and director of the criminal justice program at Wake Forest University School of Law. We have Walter Katz, who is the vice president of criminal justice at Arnold Ventures, and DeRay, who is the co-founder of Campaign Zero. I'm so thrilled to be here with you guys and everybody else who is in this panel right now. During this panel, as Monica said, we're really going to be addressing what's happened over the last year, what's happened with the range of bills we've seen passed on the state level and on the local level, what kind of reforms we've seen, and also dig into, are these reforms enough? And what more can we do and what more should we do to combat the mass criminalization and over-policing in Black and Brown communities? And how much further do we really have to go? So with that said, I want to toss it over to our panelists for opening remarks. I'd love for you to all level set for us. What makes the last year so different, so remarkable? And why do you think our country has kind of hit this breaking point? Walter, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you everyone at NACDL for having us here. But by way of background, before I was joined Arnold Ventures, I was in police oversight for a number of years and also working in mayor's offices and public safety, but my career really began as a public defender, and as a public defender for 17 years in Southern California. So I think I want to try to shape a lot of my conversation today about the practical aspect for how this type of work impacts the work of criminal defense. But this last year and 2 months or so have been monumental. I think as we went into 2021, we go back to the beginning of 2020, January, and think about the world then. And then basically we've had three essential shocks that have occurred: the pandemic, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and finally the spike in violence, the 30% increase in homicides in 2020. This year, it's so far about a 14 to 15% increase, and all those that have had impacts on policy. And specifically when it comes to what legislators have done, it's been really remarkable. The stage was set by the response to the murder of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor. That set the stage. And historically, state legislators have had very little to do with policing. It's what I would describe as a high-risk profession, but it's been a high-risk profession that has been unregulated. If you go into the state codes, it's focused on like enabling legislation, creating law enforcement. Perhaps there's a use of force statute, which basically reflects Graham versus Connor, but not much more than that. And then, of course, there are those states that have a law enforcement officer bill of rights. But what we see now over the last year and a half, especially over the last 12 months, is that legislators have really stepped into the breach. Arnold Ventures is actually the funder of the project at NCSL, which has created not only a statutory database of the legislative landscape as it was across the country in use of force standards, transparency, et cetera, but also to create the tracking tools so you can track all the legislation that has occurred since last year. We're talking over 3,000 bills. In the next month or so, they're going to be releasing a legislative trends report so you can see some of the trends that have taken place. Preliminarily, we've looked at it. About 15 states have passed a bill which mandates active bystander bills where police officers can't just stand by as their partners kill somebody with excessive force. A number of states have passed laws restricting the use of chokeholds or neck restraints, and about 21 states have passed some sort of legislation which alters the use of force standards. So just by way of background, a lot has been done. We can talk about what still needs to be done, where I'm often thinking about things like Brady discovery, law enforcement officer bill of rights, and collective bargaining rules, but I'll save that for later.
And we will definitely get into that. So with that, Cami, would you like to give us some opening remarks?
Great, thank you. I am not a doctor. I'm a juris doctor, but I love the promotion, Paige. Thank you very much. So yes, I'll just start by, okay, so what brings us here? We can talk about, and I want to talk a little bit about the Chauvin trial and the murder of George Floyd, but I think it's really important for us to understand as we level set that this was a tipping point. The reason that we saw the reaction that we did, notwithstanding the brutality of the crime that occurred, Mr. Floyd's murder, but it was because we know in this country that there have been decades, centuries of oppression of Black and Brown people at the hands of law enforcement. So just to contextualize this, we think back to, it's really important to understand the unique nature of the Chauvin trial. And at the time, there were lots of celebratory remarks, and we saw, signs of relief and celebratory crowds and the like. But it really does not indicate beginning of the type of transformative policing that we need in our country. And I'm reminded of the Derek Bell title, and we are not saved, right? So this guilty verdict, and we are not saved, right? There's so much more work to do. When you look at that trial in particular, you saw that it was tried by not by the local DAs, but by a really specialized group. We also saw the experts that were brought out for that trial. And then again, unlike most cases, we actually had the police officials within the same department noting how different the behavior was and how egregious the behavior was. So, and these are things that I think, most of us on this call know, but I think it's really important just to say that we've begun, but we're not done. We still have lots of work to do when we think about that. And so, as Walter mentioned, there've been a lot of changes, and I know that we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of this later. But there's been federal legislation that's been proposed, passed by the House, not yet by the Senate, and so we need to think about that. Everything that's in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, these have all been things that have been proposed at some point or another over the past few decades, and have not passed at the federal level. And so that makes me think about the power of what we can do at the local level, and what we've seen in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and again, that of Breonna Taylor, and all of the countless, unfortunately, the countless names we can't mention here, but we need to think about what we can do at the local level. And I just want to remind, and I'll do this throughout our remarks, the power that we have at the local level to change policing. So that's what I think we are.
Thank you so much, Cami. And I'm so glad that Walter's brought up kind of collective bargaining, and now you've brought up what we need to do on the local level, because these are all questions we are going to be addressing in this panel today. And to kind of wrap up our opening remarks, I'm going to toss it to DeRay.
I just say, so echo both what I said, I think about the protests in 2014 that laid the foundation for all of this, that was really a narrative shift. You remember 2014, it was like we were all in a million panels and talks, and it was like you couldn't get out of a panel. It was panel time. And then 2020 came around and people were like, okay, let's figure out like what we can do structurally. And that's what I think has changed. There's been more of a focus at the local level, at state levels, trying to figure out what's the what here. You know, we did as of last week, it was 20 bills around use of force that were good. But the police are continuing to play games, right? So places like Illinois did a chokehold ban, but didn't really define what chokeholds were. There were places that the news will be like, well, they did de-escalation. And really, when we look at the law, they mandated de-escalation training, which, you know, doesn't really do anything. So it's been interesting to see the games that the police play, but there are legislators now more interested in actually going to battle with the police in a way that we haven't seen. And the last thing I'll say is that, like, the next part of the work is how we protect the win. So in Washington state right now, the police are saying because of the use of force bill that they cannot put people on stretchers because touching people is actually a violation of the law. And you're like, y'all are just the worst. So how do you protect the wins, I think, is a whole different part of the work.
Thanks so much, DeRay, and thank you all. So kind of just diving into the first question, continuing at this kind of 500-foot level view of the last year, I think it's important that we acknowledge this kind of tension that we've seen in the broader movement. You know, the past year, we've seen the rise of numerous demands from organizers and advocates. And we've also seen a kind of divide between organizers, some people who are pushing for what we would call like procedural justice reforms, and then folks demanding that we defund and abolish police, that these minor tweaks and reforms are quite simply not enough. And so I'd love to hear from you. What do you say to that? And really, what does defunding the police mean to you? And I think the most important question here is, are these ideas of kind of more incremental reforms and the idea of defunding the police diametrically opposed, or are there overlaps and similarities and points where we can work together? And so to start that discussion, I'd love to pass it over to DeRay. Back to you.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, this is like a criticism we get all the time, and we did A Can't Wait, which is a big campaign around use of force. And what I'd always say to people is that I think it's actually like a tool of the police and white supremacy to pit these strategies against each other. That tons of people fight for the end of solitary confinement. The end of solitary confinement is not the end of incarceration. It's not. Now, should we get rid of solitary confinement? Absolutely. Those are not at odds with each other. And we would never suggest that they are at odds. We would never suggest, you know what, just like let people sit in solitary confinement until we end all prisons. We would say that that was an untenable solution. So when I think about things like use of force policies, when I think about things like civilian oversight in some ways, when I think about moving resources away from police to other things, none of these are the end of the police tomorrow. All of them get us closer to that. And I think the bar for me is like, does it get us closer or does it strengthen the police apparatus? I think the most of what we is in the public conversation now actually gets us closer to that. And the police fight us tooth and nail on all the things that people call incremental. You know, we're trying to ban chokeholds and the police are up here being like, we can't solve crimes. You're like, what? Just because you can't choke people to death? You know, the police are really fighting hard around the things that people anecdotally are like, this is incremental. The last thing I'd say is that when we think about this idea of like, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time, there is a version that says one bite after another. And I think we can win that way. This idea that like we take one big bite in January, one big bite in July, like I think that the elephant heals. I'm more of a like everybody bites at the same time sort of guy, that like we should have a million strategies all at once pressing the police. And we think about defund, there's a no-brainer that we should move resources away from the police. We also need to figure out how we have the scalable alternatives to the police in places where there are Black people. So right now, you know, Cahoots is in Eugene, Oregon. It's like no Black people over there. So how do we think about alternatives to the police that are not just mental health alternatives and that have been tested in places where there are people of color?
Thanks so much, DeRay. I think that's super important. I know a lot of people point to Cahoots as like a great example, and it is a good example of an alternative to police, but it is critical. And people who work for Cahoots say, you know, this is in a very white city, and it will look different and has to look different for other communities. Cami, I'd love to hear from you. What do you kind of think about this divide between what some refer to as like more incremental reforms versus defunding the police?
Right. So I will say that I am an advocate for transforming policing in the United States. I am mindful of where I am in the audience, and I think I am a former prosecutor, and so I have seen I have prosecuted people who I believe need to be incapacitated. That is not the vast majority of people who are incarcerated today. And we also know that there's a racial problem. There are racial disparities with that as well. And so when I think about our carceral state, I think that there are a number of offenses that do not need to be criminalized. So I would say that while we can, I believe, have police officers and places where we can incapacitate people who cannot, maybe should not be in other parts of society. That also that necessarily means that we need to excise a number of crimes out of our criminal codes. I mean, there are a number of, most violations do not necessitate someone being confined. So I want to be really clear with saying that the vast majority of crimes that exist on the books today don't need to be crimes. They don't need to be handled. We don't need armed first responders for most things, for traffic stops, for mental health calls, for those types of things. But I stopped short of saying, let's abolish, let's defund. But I also think that these movements can coexist. And that the reality is, what would I like to see a society that did not have police or did not have the need for those things? Yes, absolutely. That's just not the reality that we live in. And so we have to work on parallel tracks. And so while the change has been incremental and it has been far too slow, I think that we have to, thinking about the reality of where we are, we have to continue to work incrementally and make changes as we can while we are dealing with the larger part of transforming our criminal justice system. And I think that only a very small fraction of people who are currently incarcerated should be.
Thanks so much, Cami. Kind of given the, Walter, would you like to jump in here?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was going to say, given the range of approaches in police reform that Cami and DeRay have highlighted, Walter, I was curious, in your opinion, what are some of the most significant changes and reforms you've seen implemented over the last year? And what do you think needs to be done? Are those enough? And where can we go further from that?
So nowhere near enough. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
I was going
Let's
to
start
say,
with Walter, and then we'll kick it over to
I don't know why.
yeah, I wouldn't say that, no, it's not enough. I think the way that Cami has framed it, of the need for transformation, is really the lens we should be looking at it through. I've been quite influenced by the writings of Monica Bell about legal estrangement, which really lifts up the conditions of people who live in marginalized communities, which are, the Black neighborhoods in Baltimore or Englewood or Austin in Chicago, East St. Louis. These cities, which are essentially marginalized in multiple ways, almost from birth onwards, and so quickly institutionalized in so many different ways. People who live in those communities are simply not being served. And their primary point of contact with government is often policing. I just read an article this morning about the Chicago Police Department's community safety team. Now, full disclosure, right? I used to work for the former mayor of Chicago as his deputy chief of staff for public safety. So just be clear so everyone understands that. But as reading about the community safety team, which is essentially a street team to respond to in high, what they call high volume neighborhoods, over the last year plus, they've made more than 14,000 traffic stops and written only 124 citations out of 14,000 stops. Now, there's ample research that shows that traffic stops, especially unbridled traffic stops, have a corrosive effect on community trust. We also know And research, for example, using body-worn camera video shows that in generally white people who are stopped by the police are treated differently than Black motorists. They are shown more deference, more patient, allowed to explain themselves, just basically treated with more respect. So if you have neighborhoods in Chicago where there's 14,000 plus police stops in almost none of our enforcement actions, that's 13,000 plus times, which increases the sense of corrosion and distance away from government. So that detachment or that estrangement, we look at that as one of the underlying conditions, which is partially brought up in the northern cities by redlining, and southern cities through Jim Crow laws, and the legacy still lives. If we use that as our North Star for what we want to eradicate, then there's still so much more work to be done. And I know my answer here was not policy specific, and I could go deep into all sorts of policies, like one of my favorite, which is officer decertification. But I just want to give a sense of what that North Star actually is, and actually of what we're fighting for here in different ways. And the last thing is to answer your question. I describe myself more or less as a pragmatic idealist. I believe in that North Star. But to be perfectly frank, I think there were some framing arguments which came out of the last year, which have made accomplishing our goals a little bit more difficult. I'm not critiquing people who have been proponents of, for example, defund the police. I understand the argument. It's now been weaponized in a way which has made even accountability related reforms more difficult to put forward. And again, I'm not saying that because the argument's been weaponized is the fault of the proponents, but I think as we think about police reforms, or as we think about transformation, we got to think about how do we get to the win.
Thank you so much, Walter. And the same question for you, DeRay. What are kind of the most significant changes you've seen implemented over the last year? And, do you think these are enough? I think I know the answer, but just posing it. Oh, DeRay, you're on mute, sorry.
Amateur hour, a year into the pandemic, I'm still on mute. Definitely not enough. So that was easy. I think that the thing I'm heartened by is that I remember when we did the police union project in 2015, people were like, that's really cute. That was it. It was people were like, that's cute. They were not ready to fight police unions. And now people are. And that's probably the coolest, biggest structural thing I've seen is that some of the people that we had to beg to pay attention to police unions are now we get it. Police unions are a problem. And we haven't seen, I think that community is slowly coming together. So I'm excited about that. The use of force stuff was big. It's the single biggest reduction in the power of the police in American history. And we fought tooth and nail on this stuff. The police really were sneaky. And we did 8 bills around no-knocks in the United States, with Maryland being the best. And remember that the first police officer bill of rights was Maryland in 1975. It was also the first state to repeal. It was offset by Georgia just passed one and Missouri passed one. So, we're back to where we were, but the Maryland repeal was good. It's a good thing. So I'm heartened by this ripple. I'm nervous about the crime narrative and what that'll do to the next cycle of can we get anything in the next cycles? I don't know.
Thank you so much, DeRay. And yeah, crime narrative question is coming up, so stay tuned. But since DeRay already mentioned police unions, I want to kick it back to Walter because this is something you mentioned at the beginning. As everybody said so far, these reforms we've seen are just not enough. And there's been a lot of justifiable outrage at the lack of change that we've seen. So why is this the case? And what are some of the biggest hurdles, including police unions, that we're facing in accomplishing transformational change?
I think it's a great question, Paige. And I think we have to go back in history to understand the birth of police unions. For a long time, they were essentially viewed as toxic by city leaders. There's a police officer strike in Boston in the 1920s. Where officers went on strike and there was an instant crime wave, significant enough that the mayor of Boston ended up firing the entire police department and rehiring a new department. So there was no thirst for police unionization for about 40 years. And then we get into the 1960s, early 1960s, and there's increased unionization of municipal workers, but essentially not police officers. And then we got to the civil unrest of the mid and late 1960s. And what happened? That police organized around unrest, racialized it essentially, and said, this is how dangerous policing is. We have a right to be organized too. So the first real police unions have only been around for a little bit over 50 years. But as they gained power in the 70s and into the 80s, they had an outsized impact and policy impact. So not only do our police unions very, very good at protecting their own interests when it comes to wages and benefits and working conditions, they also have an outsized impact on actual public policy. And so, from one legislator to another across the country, you will see police unions flex their muscle, not only to defend against restrictions on what police do, but also to advance essentially the carceral state. You can even see that happening right now, for example, where the most recent fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill, which came out of the House, out of the Commerce, Justice, and Science appropriations bill, basically funds a significant number of police reforms in a really positive manner, including a requirement that if a police department wants to get federal grant money, it has to either be accredited or move towards accreditation. Now, accreditation is a separate conversation, whether or not that has any value or not, but that was framed as defunding, saying it's really hard to get accredited. So by attaching that condition, that's what unions said, attaching that condition to DOJ grants, it's in effect defunding the police. And they stopped the progress of that appropriations bill in its track when the House went out in recess at the end of last month. That's the kind of influence that they have. So I'm heartened, though, that if we look at a couple of states have started making progress, like DeRay mentioned. So, for example, one of the most exciting aspects of the Omnibus Criminal Justice Reform Act in Illinois, House Bill 3653, the Safety Act, which enshrined robust decertification rules. And the most powerful thing that I think they put into that language was specifically prohibiting decertification from collective bargaining. In public collective bargaining, there is mandatory bargaining, there is permissive bargaining, and there's prohibited bargaining. It's within that world of mandatory bargaining that a lot of the advances are made, which restrict accountability and transparency. So for a legislator to step up and say, this particular thing is no longer subject to collective bargaining is a powerful statement. And I think it's something that more state legislators should be doing in more policy areas touching on policing.
Thank you so much, Walter. And Cami, the same question for you. What do you see as some of the biggest hurdles on our quest for meaningful change?
Well, certainly, I would echo everything that Walter has said about police unions. I think another thing that we should be thinking about is, unfortunately, we are in the midst of a surge in violent crime. And again, from my view as a former prosecutor, there are victims there of homicide. And so folks in those communities need a lot of times to work with law enforcement to bring the perpetrators of those homicides to justice. We can have a trial and figure out their guilt or innocence, but law enforcement plays an important can play an important role in that. There are a lot of other things that we that we do need to pay more attention to in terms of the root causes of that community violence, and there are a lot of things that we can do outside of the criminal justice system to take care of those root causes. But when I think about some of the hurdles, I think that we really have to focus, we really have to emphasize that we can have police reform and it not impact or that it's not going to, having police reform is not going to impact violent crime. I do not believe that the increases that we're seeing in violent crime have there may be some relation with some of the police reform practices, but then I would say that then those are just officers that have chosen not to do their jobs. And I just think the message needs to be that we can have safe communities. It can be safe from police violence as well. And so the two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think that There are going to be folks on different sides of the issue than me who are going to try to exploit the fact. It's just like DeRay said, it's like, oh, we can't make an arrest without using a chokehold. It's like, of course you can. You can, of course, keep community safe without, indiscriminate violence against the members of those communities. So I think that we really have to make sure that we are continuing to talk with each other about those things, that whether it's the left and the right, or police and communities, or prosecutors and defense attorneys, what have you, we have to keep the dialogue going, and police reform can happen without an appreciable impact on crime.
The only thing I'd add is that, Cammie, just to push just a little bit, is that violent crime as a whole is not increasing. So it looks like homicides are increasing, right? But violent crime is not. And one of the things is that, like, we want people to, like, know what's true and what's not true, because that is how we lose and win sometimes, is that people just think that, like, you're like, no, the numbers are really not that bad, like, overall. And homicides we have a particular problem with, but as a category, violent crime is not up.
Right. And thank you for correcting me. And that's what we need to do, because we speak in these broad swaths and generalizations, and that's how messages, are misconstrued. But it is true, though, that homicides are increasing, and gun violence. We have seen an increase in gun violence. And so, but again, there are things outside of the criminal justice system that we can also do to curb that. And we don't need to laser focus on, it's police reform that's making this happen.
Yeah, I feel like you were all inside my head, because literally my next question was around how we combat this narrative that a rising crime, as DeRay said, it's much more nuanced, means we need to stop pushing for change. And really curious, DeRay, from your perspective, I know that you're a great data analyst. Like, how can we promote a critical understanding of crime data so people aren't just making these broad assumptions and we truly understand what's happening?
Yeah, I think that, so this is the $1 million question, right? So if I could figure this out, I'd be the man, because everybody's struggling with the crime data. I think that showing people is big. Like when I show people, I was talking to a state senator in New York the other day, and I just showed him the comp stat, and it was like, that you can read the chart, like I can read it. Like it's just not increasing. He's like, I never saw it. And you're like, so some of it is like, how do we just, like, help contextualize for people? I worry that I think that for some people, the strategy was like, put the graphs up, and it's like, people are stressed out by the graphs. Like, we got to, like, contextualize it, say what's true and what's not true. Like, I think that's a part of it. But it is hard, you all know this, when we poll people and ask them, is crime increasing? Everybody's like, yes. And then it just is not. And some of that too is about, like, the media. It's like the way that we cover crime, and the media feeds into this idea that crime is like the summer of terror. You're like, crime is not inevitable. Crime, like, it's not like murders just have to happen in the summer. We could actually plan for a whole bunch of activities to offset all these things during summer months. It's not like crime just, like, happens when it gets hot. Like, it just must happen like that. So I think that's a part of it, but I don't know. We're working on a project now to try and figure out how to help people just at least talk about it better. And it might not seem like a lot to be like violent crime versus murders, but homicides we can potentially do something about, but, like, arson's not up, larceny's not up, like those sort of, I thought that burglary was going to be up in a lot of places, and it's not, given the pandemic.
I think we need to be careful about how we frame arguments like that, because I think that is an area where the left sometimes gets themselves in trouble by saying, well, if you only understood how we see the world, you'd agree with us. And has a tendency, in my experience, to have backfired. The polling shows, I'm talking about both public polling and internal polling in different states, even down to the county level. I've seen consistently people think crime is going up because they see it through the lens of violent crime primarily. And they will think crime is going up consistently, even when it's not. And this is even during the great crime decline in 2013 to 2016. And even more recent polling shows that people say, yeah, violence is going up. But when you ask the second question is, do you feel safe in your own neighborhood? They'll generally say, yes. So I think DeRay's 100% right. So much of the perception about violence or about crime is being pushed through the mass media. So somebody living in a suburban county, he's all upset because crime is going up. But if he goes to his own community and looks at his own neighborhood, it's not. So trying to thread that needle is really challenging to do. And it's really challenging to do because it is impossible to have a conversation about crime without there being an undercurrent about race, right? For me, from my perspective, all conversations about violence are actually stand-in for a conversation about race and a conversation about the danger of Black people. And when crime goes up, it plays into confirmation bias. See, I told you, they're dangerous. We better do something about it. And that can include longer prison terms, that could mean aggressive policing. So all those things which we find are important for criminal justice reform and police reform is then framed as, making it hard for police to do their job. And what is the job of the police? The job of the police in so many communities in America is to keep those people out, to keep the lives of suburbanites safe. And it's hard to get around that framing, even trying to say, well, actually, overall crime is down.
Thanks so much, Walter. And Cami, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to this. No. Kind of staying on the topic of data, I think a lot of people over the last year have learned a lot. And thanks to amazing resources like Campaign Zero's amazing websites, they've learned a lot about the data and the numbers on policing. I think a lot of people were surprised to learn that police spend the majority of their time enforcing minor offenses, arresting people for low-level offenses, and far less time on what people would consider more serious crimes. And so there's been a lot of discussion, Cami, you've already mentioned this, around getting police out of the business of enforcing low-level offenses. And I'm curious to hear from you, Cami, of what progress you think has been made towards ending enforcement of low-level offenses, and what hopes do you have for future work to end that enforcement?
Right. And so I think it's actually, it starts with our legislators. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you come down with that, is that it's really not, the police can only or should only be enforcing, should only be arresting or investigating things that are actually crimes. And so we have, as our legislators, we have to cut back on what we believe are crimes. And there are a lot of things. So for example, and there have been a number of actually police departments who have made different priorities and said, we're not going to enforce, we're not going to, ticket people for seatbelt violations or minor traffic violations. We have, because you talk about data, but I also think about the role that technology can play here. There is, and when we insert technology, we might be creating more problems where we're trying to solve other problems because we know that people, Black and brown people in certain areas are over surveilled. And so that is an issue, and there are privacy concerns and things that folks in those communities have to give up that others don't. But if we have technology and we're using it, why not just have we have red light cameras, or we have license plate readers. You have those types of things where you can send a violation to. We don't need an armed person to get out of their car in the middle of the night and stop someone. And we know that it's used for its pretext often.
Thanks so much, Cami. And I want to toss the same question over to DeRay. I know you all came out with your police scorecard, which if you haven't been to that website, please go. It's amazing. And a lot of these police departments you found were spending a good chunk of time enforcing low-level offenses. So I'm curious to hear from you, what opportunities does that data present for us in pursuing more transformational changes?
I think that for us, we were trying to figure out what do we do structurally. So we learned a lot of things. One is that the police killed more people in 2020 than every year of data we have, except for one. That blew our mind. We also, we did this probably 2 years ago now. We realized that the police killed more people in suburb, that it was increasing in suburbs and rural communities in ways that we just didn't know. We all thought it was cities for such a long time. In the scorecard, we were at least we should all be starting from the same truth, right? How many people did you kill? What's the budget? How many crimes you solved? And can we make that accessible for everybody so that any activist can see it, any city can see it? And like, that's actually been really powerful. Now we know the data is like just the beginning, right? Like you can, we've known communities are bad for a long time. So like, you don't need 15 new reports to be like the police killed people in our neighborhood. But what we found that it helped people do that is really cool is that it gave them more ammunition to press for change, and it helped them see in towns that were around theirs that like it wasn't always the city. So like in Maryland, people are surprised to learn that it wasn't Baltimore City last year that killed the most people. It was Baltimore County, right? That like it actually for the first time showed you all these places that have been hiding because they weren't the biggest city in the state or something like that. And we found that to be really powerful, especially with legislators who are working on these issues.
Thanks so much, DeRay. And we have an audience question. Walter, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on the danger of separating low-level versus violent crimes? And how does such a separation further deepen the impact of state violence?
Well, as I understand the question, is the separation artificial? And in some ways, are we talking about crimes where there is a victim of violence, or are we talking about some other offense, be it a theft, a car burglary, something to that extent? I think looking at the data for how police spend their time is actually really intriguing. A paper which was just published by the lead author, Cynthia Lum from George Mason University, looked at years of call for service data and to identify that only about 4% of call for services or calls for service are for mental health related calls. Far smaller than most people would expect when they listen to the conversation going on. Only about 7% of arrests, we know from data from the Vera Institute, about 7% of arrests are for violent offenses. So if we really kind of go through the filter of asking ourselves several questions, we can actually end up in really interesting policy places, which are then informed by the data that DeRay is talking about. Question number one is, what do we want the police to be doing? And what do we want the police not to be doing? And there's a third related question. Are there other resources, mainly government resources or non-governmental resources, which can do it more effectively with fewer social costs? It's really important to weigh the social costs. Then once we've decided on what we want the police to be doing, we need to be asking, how can we make sure that it's done effectively, right? Nobody wants unsolved violent crimes. We would like shootings to be effectively investigated in a way that upholds the due process of every person, both victims as well as people who are suspected of committing that crime. And then finally, once we decide what we want the police to be doing and how we want them to be doing it effectively, what those standards should be, then the third is, how do we hold them accountable? And if we kind of walk through that step of asking those questions, we'll probably end up at a shrunken footprint for policing, hopefully a more effective use of those resources by identifying how is the money being spent and how's the time being spent, and then what they do that it's constitutional policing. And kind of that's the worldview, I think, that could be helpful in trying to think through these challenging questions for policing.
Thanks so much, Walter. We only have about 13 minutes left, so I'm going to move us ahead to some more forward-looking questions. And DeRay, I'd like to start with you, but what do you think are some of the most important changes at all levels of government, from the federal to state to local, that we can enact to end the cycle of over-policing and police violence? And relatedly, how do we hold elected officials and politicians accountable to the promises that they make to the communities they serve?
I think some of it is like, I'm always shocked at how little of the basic information is out there. Like when we did the Policing and Conduct Project, we just assumed that somebody had already done it. So when we got the contracts and we were reading them, we were like, wow, I can't believe that there's nobody had like just done an analysis of the clauses. So I was doing, we still do them. We publicly have released about 700. We have another 3,000 waiting to be put on the website. So I was doing a contract the other night, and there's a major city in America where if a police officer gets convicted of domestic violence, they stay on the rolls for another 9 months while they fight the conviction to get it overturned. That's like the contract says that. It's like it gives you 9 months so that you can try and get it reversed. If you don't get it reversed, you get another 3 months to be still a technical employee for a transition period. You're like, what in the world? So I'm always shocked at how like some of the basics isn't done. The second thing I'd say, is I think that there are a lot of legislators who their heart is in the right place. But what we found this last cycle is that the police they're in every room. The police are there. They know all the details. They got it down. And there are not enough people who know police policy really, really well. And we've seen the police just scare people. So in Maryland, like, we couldn't get the police records public because the police came in and said, if you make our records public, then you should make all ethics complaints against the legislators public. And people were freaked, and it was a whole thing, but the police are really good in the room. And sometimes like our best people aren't in the room. And just because prisons and jails doesn't mean the police. And there is a little bit of arrogance about, like, just because I know race, I know policing. And you're like, no, the police are like their own thing. In the same way that, like, I'm not an expert on prisons. I probably know more than the average Joe, but like, I'm not an expert there. I do know police.
Thanks so much, DeRay. Same question for you, Camille. What do you think some of the most important changes? I know you've already talked about state legislatures, but what are some most important changes you think need to be enacted on all levels of government? And how do we hold elected officials to those changes, accountable to those changes?
Right. Well, again, I want to talk a little bit about the federal pattern or practice authority. Now, we've seen really a hiatus from that, a complete lack of enforcement. The Trump administration did not enforce that at all. But I'm glad to see that the Biden administration has initiated at least 3, to my knowledge, Phoenix most recently, Minneapolis, and Louisville, Kentucky. These and again, there's the problems are too massive, and the Department of Justice doesn't have the resources to investigate all of the police departments that need to be investigated. But I think that having this enforcement continue at the federal level, there's a lot of information that we can learn. We can learn about a particular police department. We can try to replicate this for other things. I'm a little worried that it doesn't have the deterrent, like the thought of having an investigation doesn't necessarily have a deterrent effect for some of these police departments to say, okay, I'm going to clean up my act so that I'm not investigated. We really haven't seen or been able to prove that, but I think it's positive that they're going to be happening again, because I think there's power in the information that we can learn from those. I think when we think about holding folks accountable, again, I just go back to the information. We have in the realm of policing been acting with a complete lack of information about whether it's uses of force, whether it's the ability of officers they're not decertified, and so they can be moved, and they'll move to another jurisdiction and do the same thing. And so I think that another important trend, I don't think we're there yet, but just this explosion in the information and using that information to actually educate not only our legislators, but the general public. I mean, I think a lot of people don't know, even when you're where you have the case of like an elected prosecutor, you don't really have, there have been studies on this. My colleague, Ron Wright at Wake Forest has written on this, that people don't really know prosecutors' track record. And so it's what's put forth is, how people will vote. So it's really, I think, if I can think back over the past year, when we think about successes, is that there are a lot more people who are a lot more educated about policing. We have a lot more information, and we know the importance of having that information that we didn't have before.
Thank you so much, Cami. I do want to just move us forward and take one final audience question, which is, do you agree that we should stop using the term public safety as a synonym for law enforcement? Walter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Yes, I think so, because it's not encompassing of, in fact, I've tended to use the term community safety to really reflect to what the needs of the community are. And policing is one aspect of what it takes to have a safe community. And the extent of that aspect of policing is what's up to debate.
DeRay, same question for you, this conflation of law enforcement and public safety.
I just don't, this is one of those where like, this is probably not the popular answer, is that I'm just like not really fighting people about phrases anymore, you know, like, so like public safety is fine, community safety is fine, the police, like, I think that, you know, I think that no matter what we call them, they are here. And we should be fighting around like the structural stuff, you know? So like, I'm interested in the question of like, how much power should they have, if any? Like, should they, what kind of weapon should, like, those are the battles that I think we should be having. I just don't even know if we call them guardians of the night, we call them, like, you know, I haven't seen the narrative shift at that level actually change anything about them. And I think 2020 is a great example. We won the media in 2020. We did. And the police killed more people than every other year. The police, they are not stressed out about any of these phrases.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to all the audience members who have lingering questions, but I do want to move us on to closing remarks because we only have about 5 more minutes left together. So I'm curious to hear closing remarks from all of you. Would love to hear anything that you really want the audience members to hear that you didn't get to say yet. But also would love to hear from all of you about, you know, what would you encourage people listening to this panel to do if they want to engage further in advocacy and organizing around policing and police practices? So Cami, we will start with you for your closing remarks.
Yeah, no, I'll just be really brief here and say, you know, kind of picking up a thread from what Walter said earlier about the idea of community. I think we need to center community and center community voices. And I would even go another step to say, you know, marginalized folks whose voices are not often heard. And when we begin to do that, and people can, and we're setting priorities for what communities want, when we've done that, we've seen that police, you know, certain police departments not enforcing, again, you know, lower level drug offenses because we know the community wants them to enforce, to be there and have a presence, but to have a presence solving homicides, right? So that's one thing. And then I just would say to anyone thinking about what they can do is, you know, the power of what can happen at the local level, which is why I really appreciate DeRay's the campaign for, you know, eight can't wait. And I know lots of different cities in North Carolina thinking about that and checking those boxes. But I just think that there's power in the local community and in local elections. And I actually think that that to the extent we elect our prosecutors in many places, that we've seen real changes happen there too at the local level, and thinking about what classes of charges and what priorities they're going to set for their offices. So elections matter.
Thanks so much, Cami. And passing it to Walter for your closing remarks.
Thank you, Paige, and thanks again for moderating this discussion. Well, I wanted to keep in mind that we're talking to a community of criminal defense lawyers, and I go back to when my career began in a while ago. I came up in the world as a public defender, where public defenders and the defense bar was basically boxed out of the broader conversation about policy. You know, public defenders didn't become judges. Public defenders were not asked about what their opinion was about criminal justice policy. And I think the door's been cracked open, and I'd say that the folks who've been there on that side of the courtroom need to be involved, because you're seeing every day what the impacts are of bad policing, of prosecutorial overreach, of what happens in custody. You have a role to play. The last thing I'll say is, how do you take advantage as a defense lawyer of some of these policies that have taken place, and where places, or perhaps places that you should still be pushing for? So for example, quick Christmas list. Number 1, codification of Brady, that there should be no gray area as to what you're entitled to get. Number 2, the importance of misconduct indexes. As misconduct indexes start to gain momentum, think through about how you as a defense lawyer can use that information to your advantage. Number 3 is tapping into stop and use of force data. To see, is this particular officer acting in a particular neighborhood, for example, that is atypical from what we normally see from a police officer who works that precinct? of really trying to use that data. Oh, read the opening chapter of Suspect Citizens by Frank Baumgartner, of how defense lawyers use stop data perfectly to get somebody to an acquittal for allegedly shooting a police officer. And then think through how to use body-worn camera standards. Make sure that those body-worn camera standards, for example, include an automatic discovery term, so that as a defense lawyer, you can get the body-worn camera footage automatically, regardless of whether or not a prosecutor thinks it's Brady material or not. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Walter, for all those tangible actions folks can take. And DeRay, to wrap us up, closing remarks from you.
So just 3 things. First is that I think we can win in this lifetime. I don't think this is like a 700-year thing. I think we can do it in this lifetime. The second is like my new obsession is forensics. So for the defense attorneys here, is like I'm obsessed with just how much of it is not science. I didn't know, like that's not normally what I do, but now I'm like, oh my God, this is a scam. This is one big scam. Probabilistic genotyping, blood splatter. Like, how do we get experts for people who are too poor to find a DNA expert or a fingerprint analyst? So like we're working on projects around how can we get more organizers to understand the challenges around forensics. And the third is there's a lot of structural stuff that needs to happen around the police, around police union contracts that we'd love to work with people on, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, nuisance ordinances. And what we would say is that we have a police first approach to all this stuff, that like you can't name 3 ways you get to prison or jail that don't include a police officer. So we never think about the police as like an ancillary part of this. We always think about them as the linchpin.
Thank you so much, DeRay, and thank you to all the audience members. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Cami. It has been such a delight to be on this panel with you today. I feel so honored.